On the top floor of a red brick mill in a small English town, 26 looms stand exactly where their weavers left them, still threaded, still silent, waiting for hands that never came back. For a century, this town wove the most coveted silk on earth. Its ties hung at the throats of presidents and princes. Its mill owners built mansions and sat in parliament. It called itself the silk capital of the world, and it was right. Then it went completely broke, and the thing that ruined it was not a machine. This is the story of Macclesfield. It is a story about money, about the kind of wealth that raises a whole town out of the fields and dresses it in silk, and about how quickly that wealth can turn to dust. But underneath the money, there is a stranger truth, one that the ruined mills never quite explain to the people who wander through them today. The force that broke Macclesfield was neither a rival factory nor a war. The town grew rich by opening itself to the entire world, by pulling raw silk in from Italy and China and sending finished silk back out to every corner of it. And it was broken by exactly that same openness. The very thing that made the town was the thing that unmade it. To understand how that happened, we have to go back to a hillside, a river, and a button. Before the mansions, before the great mills, Macclesfield was a modest market town on a rise of land above the Cheshire Plain, sitting at the western edge of the Peak District where the hills begin to climb. It had received its market charter from the Earl of Chester back in 1261, and for centuries it was the kind of place history walks past rather than through. But it had three things that would matter enormously later. It had the River Bollin, running down out of the hills, fast enough to turn a water wheel and soft enough to dye fine cloth without staining it. It had a cool, damp climate, the sort of air in which silk threads stay supple instead of snapping, and it sat on the turnpike road to London, the single point through which almost all raw silk entered the country. The first thing Macclesfield learned to make was small and easy to overlook. A button. From at least the middle of the 1600s, the town became known for buttons covered in silk and mohair, a modest luxury item, small enough and cheap enough that ordinary people across the country could afford one, and profitable enough to draw skill and money into the town. It was a quiet apprenticeship. The button makers learned how to handle the thread, how to wind it and cover with it. And slowly a town of button makers began to imagine something larger. That larger thing arrived in 1743, when a man named Charles Roe built the first silk throwing mill in Macclesfield. To understand why that mattered, you have to understand where silk actually comes from, because a bolt of woven silk is the end of one of the longest supply chains in the pre-modern world. The raw thread is unwound from the cocoons of silkworms reared on mulberry leaves in the warm valleys of Italy, of Bengal, of China, thousands of miles from any English town. It arrived in Britain as a tangle of fragile filament that was almost useless until it had been twisted and combined into a strong, even thread, and that twisting was called throwing. Winding, cleaning, doubling, and then the throwing itself, a rope-like thread, both strong and elastic. Charles Roe had seen what was possible in Derby, where the Lomber brothers had built England's first great silk mill on machinery smuggled out of Italy, and he brought that ambition home. He would not stay in silk for long, drifting off into copper and other ventures, but he had lit the fuse. The button town was becoming a silk town, and it had placed itself at the exact centre of a chain that ran from a mulberry tree in Asia to a gentleman's collar in London. And then it grew, with the strange, unstoppable momentum of the Industrial Revolution. At first the mills were water-powered, tied to the pace of the Bollin. Then, around the year 1800, steam engines built by Boulton and Watt arrived, and everything changed. Freed from the river, the mills could grow taller and heavier and hungrier, rising 4, 5, 6 stories of red brick above the streets, their windows packed close to let in the light that the weavers needed. Where a handful of workshops had stood, a forest of chimneys rose. The town swelled with people walking in from the surrounding countryside, trading the uncertainty of the fields for the wage of the mill. Somewhere in these decades came the invention that would define Macclesfield silk, a device attached to the top of the loom from around 1821, called the jackward mechanism. It used a chain of stiff cards, each punched with a pattern of holes, to control every single thread of the warp, hole or no hole, up or down, so that a weaver could produce patterns of almost unlimited complexity. Flowers, crests, portraits, entire woven pictures rendered thread by thread. It was slow, exacting, expensive work, and it produced cloth that no simpler loom on earth could match. Hold that detail in your mind, because those punched cards will return at the very end of this story in a way nobody in Macclesfield could possibly have foreseen. The numbers of the rise are almost hard to believe. In 1823, the town had around 3,000 silk looms at work. 2 decades later, that figure had risen to roughly 10,000. By 1832, Macclesfield held 71 silk mills and employed something on the order of 10,000 workers, an enormous concentration of one trade in one small place. At its height, the town was described as the largest producer of finished silk anywhere in the world, with something like 5,000 looms clattering across 71 factories. So many women worked the mills that Macclesfield earned a nickname, Women's Town, with wives and daughters at the looms, and a surprising number of husbands left at home minding the babies. The whole rhythm of the place, its hours, its wages, its marriages, its meals, bent itself around the demands of the thread. And out of this roar of industry rose the men who owned it, the barons. No family embodied Macclesfield silk more completely than the Brocklehursts. They had started fittingly in buttons, taking over an old button-making firm in the 1740s, and across the generations they moved steadily upward, from buttons into silk weaving, from weaving into banking, from trade into land and parliament. Their firm, J&T Brocklehurst, would become for a time the largest silk manufacturer in the whole of Britain, its name known wherever fine silk was sold. Later still, in the 20th century, it would merge with a great printing house to form a combine so large it was known simply by its initials. For the better part of 200 years, in an unbroken line, one family carried the trade of a whole town on its back and grew immensely rich doing it. And the man who sat at the centre of it all, John Brocklehurst, born in 1788, was the closest thing the town had to a king. He was a silk manufacturer and a banker, and around the year 1800 he built himself Herdsfield House, a handsome Georgian mansion of brick and stone set in 30 acres of wooded parkland, looking down over the very mills that made the family fortune. When the Reform Act of 1832 gave Macclesfield its own seats in Parliament, the town sent John Brocklehurst to Westminster, and it kept sending him, election after election, for 36 years. He rarely even had to campaign. In a town built on silk, the silk baron was the natural sovereign. If you stay with me to the end of this video, you will see how that same man, in the last speech of his life, stood in the House of Commons and begged for the one thing that might have saved his town, and was refused. But first we have to see Macclesfield at its dazzling, dangerous peak. Because the silk that Macclesfield made stood far above ordinary cloth, it was the finest in the world, and the world knew it. Picture the product for a moment. Bolts of woven silk so lustrous they seemed to hold their own light, printed by hand in deep, saturated colours, through a slow process of dye and screen that could take days, each shade laid down and dried and fixed before the next could follow. Silk destined for the wardrobes of the wealthy, for the drawing rooms of the powerful. for coronations and courts. In the early 20th century, one particular design, a fabric of tiny repeating geometric shapes woven in muted tones of grey and black and white, became so associated with the town that it simply took its name, the Macclesfield necktie. To the sartorial experts of the age, it was nothing less than the quintessence of upper-class English taste, the sort of tie a gentleman wore precisely because it whispered rather than shouted, the mark of a man with nothing left to prove. Macclesfield's silk-clothed Ivy League campuses and English aristocrats alike. Its mills wove luxury silk for the great London houses, for Liberty of London most famous among them, cloth that passed through the finest shops on the finest streets. The range of what the town produced was staggering. Handkerchiefs and shawls, broad silk for gowns and waistcoats, ribbons and trimmings, black mourning crepe for the long Victorian rituals of grief, and on the great jacquard looms, woven silk pictures of such fineness that they are collected as works of art to this day. Each was a small triumph of a chain that stretched across the whole world. And consider what that trade actually was, because it reveals just how exposed the town had quietly made itself. Macclesfield grew no silk of its own, not a single thread. The English climate is far too cold and wet to rear a silkworm, so every ounce of raw material the town depended upon had to be carried halfway around the planet, unwound from cocoons in Italy or China or the plains of Bengal, shipped for months across open ocean, then landed and taxed and hauled north from the docks of London. And once the town had spun that foreign thread into the finest cloth on earth, it could not simply sell that cloth to itself. A town of a few tens of thousands of people could never absorb the output of 71 mills. The finished silk had to travel outward again, to London and Paris and New York, to the courts and drawing rooms and department stores of a wider world whose tastes and tariffs Macclesfield could not command. The town sat, in other words, at the narrow waist of a vast hourglass, foreign thread pouring in from one side, and finished luxury pouring out from the other, wholly dependent on the free movement of both. It was a magnificent place to stand. It was also a terribly precarious one, and it would take only a change in the rules to turn all that magnificence into ruin. The town's reputation grew so large that it slipped into the wider culture almost as shorthand for quality itself. In a Hollywood film of 1954, a character in need of the very best simply barks the instruction, "Fetch the ties from Macclesfield," and every well-dressed man in the audience understood exactly what that meant. A town of a few tens of thousands of people, tucked into the Cheshire Hills, had become a byword for luxury on the far side of the Atlantic, and the money followed the reputation. The mill owners grew rich on a scale that reshaped the landscape, building mansions and endowing churches and infirmaries, buying up estates across East Cheshire, sending their sons to Parliament and their daughters into the aristocracy. One branch of a Macclesfield silk family would eventually marry into the owners of a genuine medieval castle. This was the golden age, the town at its most extraordinary, and it is important to see it clearly and to feel the weight of it, because the higher a place climbs, the further it has to fall. But there was always a second Macclesfield standing in the shadow of the first. For every silk baron in a hilltop mansion, there were thousands of weavers, winders, throsters and dyers whose lives looked nothing like his. How could a town producing the most refined luxury on earth leave so many of its own people so close to hunger? The same industry that dressed presidents ran on the labour of families living week to week. Children went into the mills astonishingly young. One boy, born just outside the town, started work as what they called a bobbin boy at the age of 5, fetching and carrying among the machines before he was old enough to read. Wages rose and fell with the fortunes of the trade, and when the trade turned down, the owners turned the pain downward too. As early as 1815, there was a bitter dispute when weavers were told their piece rates would be cut by a quarter. The luxury at the top and the hardship at the bottom belonged to a single story, woven from the same thread on the same looms in the same town, and that combination, enormous wealth resting on a fragile, exposed trade, was about to meet the force that would bring the whole structure down. It did not come from a rival town, it came from an idea, and from the corridors of the very parliament where Macclesfield's own baron sat. The idea was free trade. For most of Macclesfield's rise, the British silk industry had been protected. Foreign silk, especially the superb cheaper silk of France, had been kept out entirely or taxed so heavily that it could not compete, giving the mills of Cheshire a high wall behind which to grow fat and confident. But across the early 19th century, a powerful movement was rising in British politics, a conviction that trade should flow freely, that tariffs were relics of a smaller age, that the whole world would grow richer if only the walls came down. In 1824, a reforming politician named William Huskisson swept away the old prohibition on imported silk and replaced it with a duty of around 30%. It was still protection, but it was a warning shot fired straight over the town's chimneys. Almost immediately, French silk began to flow in, and in the 2 years that followed, a wave of bankruptcies rippled through the English silk towns. In Macclesfield, the effect on the spinning trade was savage. The number of spindles turning in the town fell from more than 270,000 to little more than 100,000 within a few years, and the workforce in that sector collapsed from over 10,000 people to fewer than 4,000. Behind those figures were emptied workshops and families thrown onto the parish for relief. Here is where the deepest irony of the whole story reveals itself. John Brocklehurst, the silk baron, the man Macclesfield sent to Parliament again and again, was a Liberal, and the Liberals were becoming the party of free trade. He voted with them to sweep away other protections. He even backed the repeal of the laws that kept the price of bread high. And yet, when it came to silk, to the trade that fed his town and filled his mansion, he broke ranks with his own side. He described himself as a practical man rather than a theorist, and he warned that the Great Crusade against tariffs risked sacrificing industries, like his own, that genuinely needed shelter. Through the 1830s and 40s, he gave evidence to parliamentary committees, pressing for what he called better and judicious protection, fighting his own political tribe to keep the wall standing. For a while, remarkably, the wall held, and Macclesfield adapted and survived where other silk towns had already begun to die. But the tide of the age was against him, and in 1860 it finally broke through. What destroyed Macclesfield was not invented in a laboratory, it was signed in a treaty. In that year, Britain and France concluded a landmark free trade agreement known as the Cobden-Chevalier Treaty, named after the British campaigner Richard Cobden and his French counterpart. It was celebrated across Europe as a triumph of peace and commerce, a monument to the idea that open borders make open friends, and in the grand sweep of history, it was a genuine milestone. But buried within it was a clause that functioned, for one town in Cheshire, as a death sentence. The duty on imported silk was effectively swept away. The wall that had sheltered Macclesfield for a century simply vanished overnight, and the finest, cheapest silk of Lyon and the French mills came pouring across the Channel duty-free into the very market that Macclesfield depended upon for its life. John Brocklehurst saw exactly what was coming, and he tried, one last time, to stop it. On the 2nd of March 1860, an old man now past 70, he rose in the House of Commons for the final time in his long career. His last speech was a plea for fair play for the British silk manufacturers, a warning about the treaty that was about to be inflicted on the town that had made him and his family everything they were. And it failed. The treaty went through. One account records simply that it dealt a crippling blow to all but a few specialised branches of the trade. Brocklehurst would be dead within the decade, and the world he had ruled would not long outlive him. The silk baron, who had run a free trade town as a free trade member of parliament, had spent his dying political breath begging to be spared from free trade, and the country he had served for 36 years told him no. The numbers of the collapse are as brutal as the numbers of the rise were dazzling. The value of raw silk imported into Britain, a rough thermometer of the whole industry's health, stood at more than £6 million in 1860. 3 decades later, it had fallen to under 2 million. In the 1820s, when protection was still strong, something like 300,000 people had drawn their living from silk across Britain. Within a generation of the treaty, fewer than half that number remained. Behind every one of those vanished figures was a family, a rent that could not be paid, a loom standing idle in an upstairs room while the light faded outside. The mills that had roared began to fall quiet. Firms failed one after another. Work dried up, and thousands of people faced a choice that no amount of woven silk could soften: stay in a dying town or leave everything and go. Many of them left, and in leaving they wrote the strangest and most bitter chapter of the entire story. Remember that bobbin boy, the child who started work in the Macclesfield mills at the age of 5. His name was John Ryle, born just outside the town, orphaned young, raised among the looms, one of a great crowd of children, most of whom did not live to grow up. In 1839, a young man now, he sailed out of Liverpool for New York, carrying almost nothing but the skill his hometown had drilled into him since childhood. He landed in a place called Paterson in New Jersey, a town with rushing water and cheap power and no silk industry to speak of. And John Ryle built one from the ground up. He wove the first successful skein of American silk. He grew rich, became the town's mayor, designed its very coat of arms, and was crowned by history with a title that should, by rights, have belonged to Macclesfield. Father of the American silk industry. Paterson became known as Silk City, and here is the cruel symmetry of it. As Macclesfield declined, its own people poured across the ocean to feed the rival that was rising in its place. In the hardest years, something like 3,000 Macclesfield townsfolk emigrated to Paterson, carrying their expertise with them like a dowry, until the two towns were so entangled that a Paterson newspaper regularly reprinted the births, marriages and deaths from the Macclesfield Chronicle, so that emigrants could keep track of the home they had abandoned. One of Ryle's own nephews, another son of a Macclesfield silk family, would die in America worth close to $25 million, a fortune that in today's money runs comfortably into the hundreds of millions. The wealth did not vanish from the earth, it simply got on a boat. Macclesfield, in its long decline, had trained the very people who would help build the industry that competed against it, and it did so one grieving, emigrating family at a time. Back home, the decline was slow, and slowness is its own particular cruelty. A sudden catastrophe at least offers a clean ending and a single day to mourn. Macclesfield instead endured a fade that stretched across the better part of a century, the trade narrowing year by year into a handful of specialised luxuries, ties and scarves, and fine furnishing silks, the only corners of the market where sheer craftsmanship could still command a price that machines and cheap imports could not undercut. There were flickers of purpose. When the world went to war for a second time in the 20th century, silk was suddenly and urgently needed again, this time for survival rather than fashion. It was requisitioned for parachutes, each canopy swallowing something like 67 square yards of the fabric, and for the printing of escape maps, tough silk charts that a downed airman could hide inside his boot, that would not tear or rustle or dissolve in the rain, For a few years, the old skills mattered in a way no fashion house could rival, and the looms of Cheshire helped bring men home from behind enemy lines. But it was a reprieve, not a recovery, because the final blow was already being brewed, this time genuinely in a laboratory. Across the 20th century, a family of man-made fibres, rayon first and then nylon, learned to imitate the drape and shine of silk at a fraction of the cost, and cheaper silk from overseas kept flooding the shrinking market from below. The ruin that free trade had begun in 1860, chemistry and globalisation now completed. One by one, the great red brick mills fell silent, their looms sold or scrapped, their long floors swept empty. The industry that had once employed an entire town shriveled to almost nothing, and that brings us back to those 26 looms, standing threaded and silent on a top floor, waiting for hands that never came back. They are in Paradise Mill, a mill first built in the 1860s that clung on longer than almost all the others, weaving luxury silk for houses like Liberty of London right through the 20th century, until it too finally went into liquidation in 1981. When the last workers walked out, they left the looms exactly as they were, still dressed with silk, still holding their punched pattern cards, as if they had only stepped out for the afternoon and meant to return. The mill was never cleared, only stopped, and in that stillness the whole story is written, the pattern cards hanging unread, the picking sticks resting where a hand last set them down, the silk on the beam still waiting for a weaver who long ago grew old or moved away or died. Walk through Macclesfield today and you are walking through the aftermath. The mills mostly still stand, too solid and too numerous to demolish, and the town has done what old industrial towns do, which is to grow around its own ghost. Some mills are apartments now. One holds a tailoring academy. Others house small businesses beneath ceilings built for machinery that has been gone for lifetimes. The single largest employer in the town today is not silk at all, but a giant pharmaceutical company, making medicines on the edge of the town where the looms once ran. A quiet substitution of one kind of precision for another. A handful of stubborn silk firms do survive, still printing and weaving fine cloth, still sending ties out to Japan and America and Europe, keeping alive a craft that has now been placed officially on the national list of endangered heritage skills. Endangered, the very word the whole town became. And then there is the strangest afterlife of all, those punched cards, the ones that let the jacquard looms weave their impossible patterns, holes and gaps arranged in careful sequence, a language of yes and no, of on and off. That system, binary instructions fed to a machine on stiff cards, did not die with the silk trade. It travelled. It helped inspire the pioneers who first dreamed of mechanical computation, the thinkers who imagined a machine that could follow instructions punched into card, and the distant descendants of those cards ran the first computers of the 20th century. The town that lost the future of textiles had, without ever knowing it, brushed against the future of nearly everything else. The looms fell silent, but the idea sleeping inside them went on to reshape the world, which is a kind of immortality, though not the kind the weavers of Macclesfield were hoping for. So stand for one last moment on that top floor, among the 26 looms. This was the silk capital of the world. Its owners were millionaires who built mansions and sat in Parliament, and its cloth clothed the powerful of 2 continents. It grew rich by throwing its doors open to the entire world, pulling raw silk in from Asia and Europe and sending finished silk back out to them. And it was ruined the instant the world was allowed to send its own silk back in return. Its greatest baron spent his final words in Parliament trying to close the door he had helped to open, and he lost. Its finest workers carried its secrets across an ocean and used them to build the rival that helped to bury it. And now its most enduring gift to mankind is not a bolt of cloth at all, but a string of holes punched into card, the quiet ancestor of the very machine you are almost certainly watching this on. The looms are still threaded, the pattern is still set, and no one is ever coming to finish the weave. If you enjoyed this journey through the rise and ruin of Macclesfield, YouTube also thinks you are going to love the video now showing on your screen, so go ahead and give it a watch. And if you want more stories like this one, the rise and fall of the places that time forgot, consider subscribing before you go.